It could be said that time is like a mountain range. When we enter the canyons and valleys, it can feel like wandering through a maze, where all we can do is endlessly retrace our steps, and progress seems impossible. But when we eventually find our way up to one of the peaks and look down on where we had just been, we can finally appreciate how much distance we've covered, and how beautiful the valley really is. It seems a certain amount of time is required to understand the meaning of an event. But of course, there are things that escape our understanding the further we travel. The heights of previously visited mountains inevitably obscure what lies just behind them. And if we are lucky enough to find another peak high enough to see above them again, it's only with great difficulty that we are able to accurately compare the distances between them and come to a true understanding of their relative significance. We seem to be standing at just such a peak in history as we begin to uncover all sorts of archaeological and psychological truths which have been just out of sight until now. The complicated origin of humanity has started to emerge in greater detail, but this only comes at a time when our species has become capable of causing the extinction of all life on Earth. As Georges Bataille said just 50 years ago, when the threat of atomic war was more real than ever before, I am simply struck by the fact that light is being shed on our birth at the very moment when the notion of our death appears to us. In fact, only recently have we begun to discern with a kind of clarity the earthly event that was the birth of man. But what about everything in between our birth and this present moment? Has it been cast in a shadow by the monumental idea of the beginning of Homo sapiens? What if the idea of the birth and death of man is precisely what prevents us from understanding his life? For at least the last few centuries, the study of history has undergone a metamorphosis thanks to many scientific discoveries and the emergence of new technologies. Although we may have grown accustomed to the goal of giving an objective and undistorted account of the past, there is still a strongly artistic and imaginary component to the historical enterprise, perhaps left over from a time before knowledge could be instantaneously accessed, when people had to rely much more on custom and traditional forms of wisdom. As the study of history continues to shift and serve different purposes in the age of the internet and mass media, it may be worth keeping in mind that the knowledge we have at our disposal is not neutral, and that our ability to remember the past has become increasingly dependent upon how we relate to technology. In this series of videos, I want to consider the conditions governing the creation of history, and this can be meant in two ways. First, the atmospheric conditions which any imaginary picture of the past needs in order to grow and thrive in. And second, the unbreakable chain of conditions to which we are inevitably bound, and which we are prone to forget about due to the tranquilizing effects of the first type of condition. Both conditions are woven into our concept of history, but it is primarily the first one which we can most easily deal with. The other, more difficult aspects of history can only be accessed through the analysis and exposure of the limitations in our artificial constructions. But to do this, we must become familiar with the unconscious habits we have inherited from centuries-long practices. On one hand, it can appear that the study of history is itself antiquated, or out of place, and that the modern age has become generally ahistorical and estranged from its own origins. Yet, on the other hand, I think it can be well established that modernity actually requires an image of the past in order to maintain its own self-definition, and that this image has a definite history of its own. Imagination has always been needed to do history, but because of how far back human history now extends, aesthetic constructions must play a larger part in our history than ever before. The aesthetic aspects of history appear to enable us to envision a world that no longer exists, and to project ourselves into that world, whether we call it classical antiquity, the ancient world, or even prehistory. But there is a tendency for this projection to obscure things by causing us to believe we know something objective about the past, when in fact our knowledge only stems from an elusive subjectivity. Most who study history would be inclined to say that the goal is to understand the past so that we can understand ourselves. But it can be argued that things actually work the other way around. If we take a step back from the study of history, we quickly realize that our progress towards understanding anything beyond the limited horizon of the present, let alone what exists within its bounds, was only that, a single step. By distractedly leaping to and fro across the gap between the present and the distant past, the effects of our actual history are displaced onto a screen, which appears to stand as an independent cause of our world. Yet this screen can only be understood as an expression of our desire to be free from the long chain of events that have led to our current moment. As James I. Porter points out, although modernity may appear to have invented an image of the past, modernity did not invent itself. Despite the monumental illusions that seduce us into projecting our restricted view onto the past, our society has a real and unspoken history, which is most active precisely when it is denied or forgotten. As Nietzsche says, "For since we are the outcome of earlier generations, we are also the outcome of their aberrations, passions, and errors, and indeed their crimes. It is not possible wholly to free oneself from this chain. If we condemn these aberrations and regard ourselves free from them, this does not alter the fact that we originate from them. Though, even if this is true, every time we try to close the gap between the past and the present, by explaining how we are linked to this chain of cause and effect, there is always a remainder which seems to resist interpretation. This could mean our explanations are not correct, but it can also point to the fact that in order for us to sketch events that have already transpired, these events must in some sense be absent, so that they can give room to our attempt to recapture them through words, pictures, and other symbolic representations. In other words, we are always too close to history to see it in full view. While we may never get a complete, unified, and authentic picture of the past, we can still locate traces of forgotten events through more indirect means. I think it's good to be reminded that it is only through analogy that we can come close to an understanding of the complicated and unpredictable nature of the historical process. Although it may seem as if we have moved beyond the mythological and naive views of the past, as if we have somehow found and climbed the highest mountain and have no need to return to the warm valley below, an investigation into the artistic side of history reveals that our history, philosophy, and science have yet to overcome their contradictory origins. By critically analyzing how the study of history has developed, and tracing the sources of our natural interpretations and the needs they are based on, it becomes possible to imagine what a genuine history would look like. In the next video, we're going to take a closer look at a specific moment in the past, a moment that changed how we view history, and set the tone for nearly all historical scholarship since. But of course, the only way we'll be able to access this moment is through the example of an exceptional personality who struggled to live apart from his time.